So I want to go ahead and highlight and move to the Juneteenth announcement. And in just a moment, I'm going to bring, well, there we go. So I asked Beverly Tatum, who of course is a noted author and president emerita of Spelman College. And I've asked Sheffield Hale as well, CEO of the History Center, to join us just for a brief conversation and perspective on Juneteenth and what it means. And Beverly, maybe we can start with you. In many respects, Juneteenth has been building since it was first announced 156 years ago. I'm not sure it's well understood. I'm not sure, it's followed in pockets, but it's gaining momentum. Can you maybe just put a little perspective, how you see it, about where we are with Juneteenth and what it means?
Sure. Well, let me just say that as we know, the date comes from the announcement that was made in 1863 in Texas, letting the enslaved people and their enslavers know that, in fact, slavery was to come to an end. And the celebration that came from the folks who had been enslaved certainly is understandable. The joy at the release of bondage and being aware of that was certainly important. But I have to say that I grew up in Massachusetts, and having grown up in the Northeast, Juneteenth was not on my radar at all. I was not aware of this as a historic date. It wasn't something that was celebrated in Massachusetts. And so it was really in my adulthood that I learned about Juneteenth. So I know that some people, perhaps if you lived in Texas or one of the other southern states, or Colorado, I know has had a long history of celebrating Juneteenth. It may be more part of your experience, but it wasn't necessarily part of mine. But having said that, I do think it is symbolically significant that President Biden decided to make it a federal holiday, because I think it is the only holiday that I can think of that really acknowledges the significance of slavery to the United States as a nation. It speaks to the joy that comes at the hope of freedom. I think it is also important to acknowledge that even though it's often described as commemorating the end of slavery, it really doesn't, because slavery persisted after that in other states until the passage of the 13th Amendment. And I'm sure Sheffield may have some thoughts on this. History tells us that after the end of the 8 years of Reconstruction, once the federal government left the South, there was essentially a process of re-enslavement of Black people through the system of convict leasing and sharecropping. So when I think about what's actually being celebrated on Juneteenth, I think it's more the celebrate of the idea of freedom than actual freedom, but something for us to continue to reflect on.
Well, it's so wonderful. I mean, you've highlighted how it is a journey. It started with Emancipation Proclamation, but that did not end slavery. Juneteenth was, I think, celebrated the end of slavery, but that in and of itself did not end slavery. And in fact, many years, 100 years, it had to continue to start making progress. And as you've indicated, this is a journey, and it's not an end to that journey. It's a continuing story unfolding. So Sheffield, I know you've done a lot in this area with the History Center. The History Center has been working on this since, if I remember correctly, 2013. So you've been, I don't know if you've been anticipating this day in and of itself, but tell us a little bit about your work with the History Center, what the History Center has been doing that has broadened into a more national effort.
Yeah, so for the last 6 years, we've been working with a group called of historians across the country to try to come up with ways to reach a broader audience. But since 2013, we have had a Juneteenth celebration, free day. The History Center has been virtual for the last 2 years, but it's something that we've done and we thought was particularly important. And with this group that we started 6 years ago of history museums across the country called Made by Us, we have been trying to reach people between 15 and 30 years old. Well, last year in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and all that happened there, one of the things that we saw nationally was people were becoming disillusioned with the 4th of July. And you saw some of that and we were like, wow, what can we do about that? And so we've come up with this idea called a civic season to connect Juneteenth to the 4th of July and to try to explain in all the messiness that is there, our country's history, but also the hope of the country, for the country. And it's we've got over 100 institutions across the country working on this. The city of Madison, Wisconsin today just announced that it was a civic season for them for that period between Juneteenth and 4th of July. And now that it's a federal holiday, it makes even more sense that we connect those two federal holidays and activate people in a non-political way, in a non-political time, how to get them civically engaged and less cynical about their government.
Well, and such a powerful movement that you've started. So you've expanded the lens, right? It's not, and it's incredible. You're linking not only the independent spirit of Juneteenth, but also the independence of our nation on July 4th and connecting those two, which should help make Juneteenth have teeth to it. Some of the concern I've seen is maybe Juneteenth just becomes another Hallmark card day where just on that day we think about what it means and then move on with our lives. Question for both of you. I mean, are you optimistic that we can actually keep this as a broader movement? And Sheffield, I think the infrastructure you're helping to put in place will do just that. But do you feel like we can keep this as a real lasting date and not just a holiday moment?
I think the work that Sheffield and the other history centers are doing is really critical, because in order to really understand Juneteenth, you have to really understand American history. And I think that in my own teaching experience in the 20 plus years that I taught before I became a college president, I found that a lot of my students had very limited understanding of American history. I am troubled by what seems to be a push to keep limited information in our schools about the history of the struggle for human rights and civil rights in our nation. And so that's a concern of mine. I'm also concerned about the what seems to be a targeted assault on voting rights. But I think to the extent that we are able to focus on the journey toward freedom, greater equity, greater equality, and understand the historic barriers to that, the bumps along the way, so to speak, I think it will be meaningful. If we, if we just say, oh, let's celebrate, quote, Freedom Day, without acknowledging the fact that freedom is a struggle and continues to be, then I think we will have missed the point.
Well, wonderful perspective there. And Sheffield, let's just go back just for maybe in our closing, you mentioned some skepticism about democracy or just our sense of being jaded about our democracy. And in a way, Juneteenth is helping, as Beverly just outlined, reawakening and broadening our understanding about our historical perspective. How do you see democracy being jaded, and what is the work you're doing going to help build that spirit of democracy through Juneteenth?
Well, I think you see the issue with democracy. People are giving up on it. It seems like on both sides of the spectrum. And you're seeing a lot of cynicism, and particularly these young people, the 15 and 30, they've seen, pandemics. They came out of the 2008 crisis, and they're wondering where their place in this community is. And so we're trying to give them actionable steps that they can take to reflect or to learn, and these history museums across the country come up with these hundreds of different ways that they can do that. So we're trying to reach them where they are, how they want to be reached, but for them to engage in something hopeful. And I think Juneteenth to 4th of July, at the end of the day, you can say, if you combine them and you bring them together, you could see the whole panoply of what this country offers in terms of positive history is also there. Our potential for growth is there. That's what I think that Juneteenth and the 4th of July mean.
Well, that's a wonderful combination, and thank you for literally building that spirit, that culture, that infrastructure to make it happen. I believe, I know the center's been celebrating it all month. There's a final event tonight? Is that correct? It's virtual.
That's correct. We have Andrew Young is talking about C.T. Vivian's book tonight. I mean, his posthumous memoir online at 6:30 tonight. So please join us with the authors of the book. And Andrew Young. And if you want to be engaged with the civic season, send it to all your people, thecivicseason.com. Thecivicseason.com, correct? Yes.
Great.
Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you both. This is just a short segment, but it's an important one. It's an important landmark. Juneteenth is bigger than ourselves. And, Sheffield, the History Center has been working since 2013. So I know the coming year is going to be even bigger and better in building that momentum. So Sheffield, thank you. Beverly, thank you. Your perspectives just in the context of race and the development of the journey is so important. So thank you both for taking the time to pull this together just in the last 24 hours. We appreciate it.